August 20th, 1989. Beverly Hills, California is a world unto itself, a kingdom of manicured lawns, whispering palm trees, and sprawling mansions that stand as monuments to success. On this particular Sunday night, the air on North Elm Drive is warm and still, carrying the sweet, heavy fragrance of night-blooming jasmine. It's a peaceful, idyllic scene, the very picture of the American dream in its most opulent form. Inside the grand, Spanish-style villa at number 722, however, that dream has just been shattered into a million unrecognizable pieces. The house, a $4 million fortress of wealth and status, is shrouded in a profound and unnatural silence. This is the home of the Menendez family, a family that, to the outside world, had it all. At its head was Jose Menendez, a man who embodied the rags-to-riches immigrant story. Having fled Castro's Cuba as a teenager with nothing, he had, through sheer force of will and a notoriously ruthless ambition, climbed to the pinnacle of the corporate world. He was the CEO of Live Entertainment, a major player in the burgeoning home video market, a man known for his sharp mind, his aggressive business tactics, and his Midas touch. He was 45 years old and at the peak of his power. His wife, Mary Louise, known to everyone as Kitty, was 47. A former beauty queen, she was elegant, poised, and the perfect corporate wife. But behind the polished facade was a woman known by those in her inner circle to be deeply troubled. A fragile soul battling chronic depression, anxiety, and a growing dependence on alcohol and prescription pills. She was a woman haunted by a private sadness that no amount of wealth could cure. And then there were the sons, the golden boys, Lyle and Erik. At 21, Lyle was the older brother, a student at Princeton University. He was handsome, confident, and possessed a charismatic, almost domineering personality that mirrored his father's. Erik, 18, was the younger, more sensitive one. A gifted tennis player with aspirations of going pro, he was quiet, introverted, and often lived in his older brother's shadow. They drove expensive cars, wore designer clothes, and attended the best schools. They were the heirs to a fortune, the living proof of their father's success. But on this night, the fortress had been breached, and the silence within its walls was the silence of death. The first sound to break that quiet was the frantic, desperate fumbling of a telephone, followed by the panicked beeps of 3 numbers being dialed, 911. The call that came into the Beverly Hills Police Department dispatcher was a torrent of raw, unrestrained hysteria. The voice on the line was almost incomprehensible through the choked sobs and gasping breaths. It was Lyle Menendez. He screamed that someone had killed his parents. He and his brother had just gotten home from the movies. He wailed, they found the door open, and then they found them. The dispatcher, trained to remain calm in the face of chaos, tried to get information, but Lyle was a whirlwind of theatrical grief. He couldn't say if they were breathing. He just kept screaming that there was blood everywhere, that his mother had been shot. It was a performance of absolute heart-wrenching devastation. When the first police officers arrived at 722 North Elm Drive minutes later, they were greeted by a scene of carefully orchestrated chaos. Lyle was on the front porch, still on the cordless phone with the dispatcher, his face a contorted mask of anguish. Erik was on the sprawling green lawn, rolling on the grass, wailing with a grief so profound it seemed to be tearing him apart from the inside. The officers cautiously entered the home, their hands on their service weapons, not knowing what they would find. The interior was pristine, lavishly decorated, showing no signs of a struggle or a robbery. They followed the sounds of a still-blaring television into a cozy, book-lined den, and there they found the source of the son's despair. The scene was one of almost unimaginable carnage. The air was thick with the coppery smell of blood and the acrid scent of gunpowder. Slumped on the blood-soaked couch was Jose Menendez. He was barely recognizable. Multiple shotgun blasts, delivered at close range, had obliterated his head. On the floor nearby lay Kitty Menendez. Her body was riddled with gunshot wounds, and like her husband, her face had been destroyed by a final, gruesome blast. The sheer brutality of the attack was stunning, even for seasoned homicide detectives. This was not a robbery gone wrong. Jose's expensive Rolex watch was still on his wrist. Kitty's diamond rings still sparkled on her fingers. Valuable art and electronics were untouched. This was personal. This was an execution. It was an act of pure, unadulterated rage. The killers had not just wanted Jose and Kitty Menendez dead. They had wanted them erased. In the immediate aftermath, the Beverly Hills Police Department, led by detectives Les Zoiler and Tom Dillard, began to piece together what happened. The grieving brothers, now orphans, offered a theory. It was a mob hit. Jose, they explained, was a tough businessman. He had made enemies. He was involved in the home video industry, a world that sometimes brushed up against shady characters and organized crime. Perhaps one of his deals had gone bad. It was a plausible theory, and the police initially pursued it, digging into Jose's complex and often contentious business dealings. But the evidence at the scene told a different story. A professional hit is typically clean, efficient. A single bullet to the back of the head. This was the opposite. It was messy, frenzied, and characterized by an astonishing level of overkill. The use of shotguns, the multiple wounds, the deliberate destruction of the victims' faces. It all pointed not to a cold, calculated business transaction, but to a deeply personal, white-hot hatred. Furthermore, there was no sign of a forced entry. The killers had come and gone as if they had a key, and most tellingly, they had been remarkably careful. The crime scene was littered with blood and gore, but the killers had meticulously picked up every single shotgun shell casing. The murder weapons, two 12-gauge shotguns, were nowhere to be found. This combination of extreme, explosive violence and cool-headed forensic awareness was a bizarre contradiction that puzzled investigators. In the days and weeks that followed, Lyle and Erik Menendez played the role of tragic orphans to perfection. They were surrounded by concerned relatives and friends, offering comfort as the boys seemed to drown in a sea of sorrow. They delivered a moving eulogy at their parents' memorial service, their voices breaking as they spoke of their love and loss. They appeared to be two young men whose privileged world had been irrevocably shattered. But behind the scenes, the detectives watching them began to notice cracks in the facade. Their grief, so powerful and overwhelming in public, seemed to be an emotion they could turn on and off at will. And then there was the money. Jose and Kitty Menendez had left behind a vast fortune, estimated at around $14 million, and their orphan sons, the sole beneficiaries, did not wait long to start enjoying it. The spending began almost immediately, and it was breathtaking in its scope and audacity. Just days after his parents were laid to rest, Lyle Menendez walked into a high-end dealership and purchased a brand-new charcoal gray Porsche 911 Carrera. He bought a flashy new Rolex watch, an upgrade from the one his father had given him. He invested heavily in a wing and rib restaurant in Princeton, New Jersey, renaming it Mr. Buffalo's. He and Erik left the family mansion and moved into separate luxury penthouse apartments. Erik, not to be outdone, hired a full-time live-in tennis coach for a salary of $60,000 a year, determined to pursue his professional tennis dreams. He bought a new Jeep Wrangler and competed in a series of tournaments in Israel and across the United States, traveling first class. Together, they embarked on epic shopping sprees, dropping thousands of dollars at a time on designer clothes from Armani and Versace. They took lavish vacations, dining at the finest restaurants, and living the lives of young playboys who had just won the lottery. To some, this might have been seen as a desperate, reckless attempt to numb the pain of their unimaginable loss, retail therapy on a millionaire's scale. But to Detective Zoller and the other investigators who were discreetly monitoring them, it looked like something else entirely. It looked like a motive. The police were building a circumstantial case, but it was slow, painstaking work. The mob theory had completely fizzled out. The focus of the investigation was now narrowing, quietly but inexorably, onto the two people who had the most to gain from the murders: the sons. The missing piece of the puzzle remained the murder weapons and the lack of any direct evidence linking the brothers to the crime. For 6 long months, the investigation seemed to stall. The public saw 2 tragic young men trying to piece their lives back together, while the police saw 2 prime suspects enjoying the spoils of their horrific crime. The case was growing cold, and then the entire investigation was blown wide open, not by a piece of forensic evidence, but by a secret whispered in the supposed sanctity of a therapist's office. Erik Menendez was not handling the pressure as well as his older brother. While Lyle seemed to slip into his new role as a young millionaire with ease, Erik was unraveling. He was plagued by nightmares, racked with guilt, and consumed by a paranoid fear of being caught. He confided in a friend who urged him to seek professional help. Erik began seeing a psychologist named Dr. Jerome Oziel. In the supposed safety of their sessions, Erik's carefully constructed emotional armor began to crack. He was a young man in torment, haunted by the memory of what he had done. On October 31st, 1989, Halloween night, Erik Menendez broke down completely. In a torrent of tears and anguish, he confessed everything to Dr. Oziel. He recounted in chilling, graphic detail how he and Lyle had planned and carried out the murders of their parents. A few days later, on November 2nd, Lyle, having learned that his brother had confessed, stormed into Dr. Oziel's office. He was furious and panicked. He openly threatened the psychologist, trying to intimidate him into silence and ensure the secret remained buried. This led to a joint session with both brothers, during which they, together, recounted the entire story of the planning and execution of the patricide and matricide. Under normal circumstances, these confessions would have been inadmissible in court, protected by the sacred seal of doctor-patient confidentiality. But Dr. Jerome Oziel was a flawed and deeply unethical man. He was having an affair with a volatile woman named Judalyn Smith. In a stunningly foolish and unprofessional decision, Oziel had secretly been recording his therapy sessions with the Menendez brothers. He was so frightened by Lyle's threats that he even had his mistress Judalyn hide in a nearby closet during one of the sessions to act as a witness. The relationship between Oziel and Smith was toxic and eventually imploded. Feeling used and terrified, Judalyn Smith did the one thing the brothers never anticipated. She went to the police. She told them everything she had heard. She told them about the taped confessions. It was the bombshell the Beverly Hills Police Department had been waiting for. The revelation of the tapes ignited a fierce legal battle. The defense argued that the recordings were a clear and illegal violation of patient privilege. The prosecution countered that Lyle's threats against Dr. Oziel voided that privilege as the therapist's life was in danger. After a lengthy court fight, the California Supreme Court ruled that a portion of the tapes, specifically those containing the confessions, could be admitted as evidence. The net was closing. On March 8, 1990, nearly 7 months after the murders, Lyle Menendez was arrested by a swarm of police officers as he was leaving a friend's house in Beverly Hills. 3 days later, Erik, who had been traveling in Israel, was arrested the moment his plane touched down at Los Angeles International Airport. The Golden Boys were in handcuffs, their lives of luxury replaced by the cold reality of a jail cell. The story exploded into the national consciousness. The image of the 2 handsome, clean-cut, and wealthy brothers, now charged with the brutal slaughter of their own parents, was irresistible to the media. They were on the cover of every newspaper and magazine. The central question that captivated America was simple, yet profound. Why? Why would 2 young men who had seemingly been given every advantage in life, wealth, education, opportunity, commit such a monstrous and unnatural crime? The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorneys Pamela Bozanich and Lester Kuriyama, offered a simple, powerful, and easily digestible answer: greed. They painted a picture of Lyle and Erik as spoiled, narcissistic sociopaths who had grown impatient. They were tired of living under the thumb of their domineering and controlling father who held the purse strings. They wanted access to the family fortune and they wanted it without any strings attached. They wanted the freedom to live as they pleased. The murders, the prosecution argued, were nothing more than a cold-blooded business transaction. The brothers had liquidated their parents in order to inherit their assets. The extravagant spending spree was not a sign of grief. It was the entire point of the crime. It was proof of their motive. This narrative of spoiled rich kids killing for cash seemed to fit the Beverly Hills stereotype perfectly, and was, for a long time, the only version of the story the public knew. Then came the trial, and with it, a defense that would turn the case and the country on its head. The trial began in the summer of 1993, and thanks to the new 24-hour cable network, Court TV, it was broadcast live into the homes of millions of Americans. The nation was about to get a front-row seat to one of the most sensational and controversial legal dramas in modern history. Erik's defense was led by Leslie Abramson, a brilliant, tenacious, and fiercely passionate attorney who would become as famous as her clients. Lyle was represented by the equally capable Jill Lansing. Together, they were about to present an alternative answer to the question of why, an answer so shocking and disturbing that it would challenge everything the public thought they knew about the Menendez family. The defense did not argue that the brothers were innocent. With the confession tapes, that would have been impossible. Instead, they admitted that Lyle and Erik had killed their parents. Their entire case rested on explaining why they had done it, and the reason, they claimed, was not greed. It was terror. It was survival. Leslie Abramson stood before the jury and began to tell a story not of a perfect family, but of a private, hidden hell. She argued that for their entire lives, Lyle and Erik Menendez had been the victims of unimaginable and relentless psychological, physical, and sexual abuse at the hands of their parents. The trial became a public autopsy of the Menendez family dynamic. Witness after witness, including family members, friends, and the brothers themselves, took the stand to dismantle the image of the idyllic Beverly Hills household. They portrayed Jose Menendez not as a driven father pushing his sons to succeed, but as a monstrous, sadistic tyrant. He was a man obsessed with control and perfection, who subjected his sons to a relentless campaign of emotional and psychological torture. He humiliated them, belittled them for any perceived failure, and cruelly pitted them against each other. But the most explosive and controversial part of the defense centered on the allegations of sexual abuse. In testimony that left the courtroom and the nation watching at home, stunned and silent, Erik Menendez, often breaking down into uncontrollable sobs, described a horrific secret history of sexual molestation by his father, beginning when he was just 6 years old. He detailed years of abuse that left him scarred, filled with shame, and living in a state of constant fear. Lyle, he testified, had also been a victim, and their mother, Kitty, was not an innocent bystander. The defense portrayed her as a deeply damaged and unstable woman, a chronic alcoholic and drug addict who was also a victim of Jose's domineering nature. But instead of protecting her sons, she had enabled the abuse. Trapped in her own miserable existence, terrified of her husband, and prone to violent mood swings and suicidal thoughts, she was depicted as a co-conspirator in her own children's torment, sometimes even participating in their psychological abuse. The defense strategy was to argue for a verdict of manslaughter based on a concept known as imperfect self-defense. They claimed that in the days leading up to the murders, the brothers had finally begun to confront their parents about the abuse. This, they argued, had pushed the volatile and controlling Jose to a breaking point. The brothers, they testified, became genuinely convinced that their parents were going to kill them to silence them forever and protect the family's dark secret. The purchase of the shotguns just days before the killings was not evidence of premeditation for a murder plot, but a desperate act of fear. They bought the guns, they claimed, because they believed their lives were in imminent danger. On the witness stand, both brothers recounted their version of the events of August 20th. They described a final terrifying confrontation that evening, a moment when a lifetime of fear, rage, and trauma erupted in an explosion of violence. They shot their father to stop the monster who had destroyed their childhoods, and they shot their mother, they claimed through tears, in a twisted act of panicked mercy, to put an end to her pathetic, pain-filled life. The nation was captivated and deeply divided. Was this a genuine, heartbreaking account of two severely traumatized young men who had finally been pushed beyond their breaking point? Were Lyle and Erik victims who had committed a justifiable, if tragic, act of survival? Or, as the prosecution vehemently argued, was this entire abuse narrative a brilliant, cynical, and completely fabricated lie? A slain parent defense concocted by expensive, clever lawyers designed to manipulate the jury's emotions and help two cold-blooded killers escape justice. The prosecution fought back with everything they had. They presented witnesses who swore the Menendez family appeared happy and normal. They relentlessly pointed out the complete lack of any corroborating physical evidence. No police reports, no hospital records, no testimony from anyone who had ever seen a single bruise on the boys. They painted the brothers as masterful actors and manipulators, capable of summoning tears on command, just as Lyle had faked his hysterical grief on the 911 call. They repeatedly brought the jury back to the spending spree. Would truly traumatized victims, horrified by what they had been forced to do, immediately go out and celebrate by buying Porsches and Rolexes? Prosecutor Pamela Bozanich argued that the abuse defense was a disgusting insult to real survivors of child abuse and a desperate last-ditch effort to evade responsibility. For months, the trial was the biggest story in America. People debated the case at work, at home, and everywhere in between. You were either on Team Abramson, believing the brothers were victims, or on Team Bozanich, believing they were greedy monsters. The case became a cultural referendum on wealth, privilege, the hidden secrets of families, and the very nature of victimhood. In January 1994, after 6 months of grueling testimony and lengthy deliberation, the juries delivered their verdicts. Or rather, they didn't. In a stunning outcome, both of the brothers' separate juries announced that they were hopelessly deadlocked. They couldn't reach a unanimous decision. In both cases, jurors were split between first-degree murder, second-degree murder, and voluntary manslaughter. A significant number of jurors on both panels believed the abuse claims and felt that the brothers' fear, while perhaps not reasonable enough for a full self-defense claim, was genuine enough to reduce their crime from murder to manslaughter. The judge had no choice but to declare a mistrial. For the Menendez brothers and their defense team, it was a tremendous victory. They had stared down the death penalty and walked away. But their freedom was short-lived. The Los Angeles District Attorney's Office, furious at the outcome, immediately announced that they would retry the case. The second trial, which began in late 1995, was a starkly different affair. The legal climate had changed, and the deck was now stacked heavily against the defense. The same judge, Stanley Weisberg, presided, but he made a series of critical rulings that would gut the defense's strategy. First, he banned cameras from the courtroom. The intense media spotlight and the public sympathy it had generated for the brothers were gone. This time, the proceedings would be a more sterile, clinical legal exercise. More importantly, Judge Weisberg severely restricted the abuse testimony. He ruled that the defense could no longer present the years of alleged abuse as a direct provocation for the killings under the imperfect self-defense theory. The narrative of a lifetime of trauma culminating in a final, fearful explosion was now much harder to argue. The new lead prosecutor, David Kahn, was also a more formidable and focused adversary. He systematically and unemotionally dismantled the abuse claims, portraying them as a convenient fantasy. He kept the jury's attention squarely on the brutal, undisputed facts of the crime itself. He had the brothers reenact their movements on the night of the murders. He highlighted the chilling detail that after the initial barrage of shots, Lyle had run out to his car to retrieve more ammunition, returned to the den, and delivered the final, face-destroying shot to his mother as she lay moaning on the floor. Kahn asked the jury, Is that the act of a terrified child, or a cold-blooded executioner ensuring there are no witnesses? He hammered home the evidence of premeditation, buying the shotguns, creating an alibi by going to see the movie Batman and buying tickets, and the meticulous cleanup of the shell casings. Stripped of its emotional core and the constant media attention, the defense case crumbled. The brothers, testifying for a second time, seemed less like sympathetic victims and more like rehearsed performers. Their tears appeared calculated. The raw, shocking power that their story held in the first trial had evaporated. This time, there would be no deadlock. On April 17, 1996, the jury delivered its verdict. Lyle and Erik Menendez were found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The jury also found true the special circumstances of murder for financial gain and multiple murders, making both brothers eligible for the death penalty. During the sentencing phase, Leslie Abramson made a final, impassioned plea for their lives, once again invoking the specter of the abuse she so firmly believed they had endured. The prosecution demanded death, labeling them as the ultimate evil, children who murder their parents for money. In the end, the jury chose to spare their lives. On July 2, 1996, Judge Weisberg sentenced both Lyle and Erik Menendez to 2 consecutive terms of life in prison, with no possibility of parole. As they were led from the courtroom in shackles, their lives as free men were officially and irrevocably over. The case was closed, but the story was not. In the decades that have passed, Lyle and Erik have grown from young men into middle age behind the walls of the California prison system. For 22 years, they were kept in separate facilities, their unbreakable bond severed by correctional policy. Both brothers eventually married women who had contacted them after seeing the trials on television, maintaining their relationships through letters, phone calls, and prison visits. Erik, in the few interviews he has given, has expressed what appears to be profound remorse, especially for the murder of his mother. He has never wavered, however, from his insistence that the abuse was real and that it was the direct cause of the killings. The public's fascination with the case ebbed and flowed over the years, but it never truly disappeared. Then, in the 21st century, something unexpected happened. A new generation, too young to have witnessed the trials unfold in real time, discovered the case through the internet. They watched old court TV clips on YouTube and saw snippets of the brothers' tearful testimony and viral videos on TikTok. In a new cultural era, one far more open to discussions about mental health, trauma, and the complexities of abuse, many of these young people came to a startlingly different conclusion than the 1996 jury. They saw Lyle and Erik not as greedy monsters, but as tragic victims of a broken system and a horrific family secret. A powerful online movement advocating for their release or a new trial gained momentum, arguing that the brothers had suffered a grave injustice. The case has been endlessly re-examined in documentaries, books, and podcasts, with some arguing that new evidence has emerged that supports the abuse claims, including a letter Erik wrote to a relative years before the murders that seemed to allude to his father's misconduct. The central polarizing question remains as unsettled today as it was in 1993. What is the absolute truth of what happened inside that Beverly Hills mansion? Were Jose and Kitty Menendez loving, if flawed, parents who were brutally executed by their sociopathic sons in a cold-blooded grab for their inheritance? Or were they the architects of a private family hell, monstrous abusers who created the very trauma that led to their own violent demise? The law delivered its verdict long ago, but the court of public opinion remains, and may forever remain, hopelessly deadlocked. In 2018, the story took a final poignant turn. After more than 2 decades of forced separation, Lyle Menendez was transferred to the R.J. Donovan Correctional Facility in San Diego, the same prison where Erik was housed. Photos soon emerged of the 2 brothers, now graying men in their 50s, embracing in a prison yard. They were together again, the 2 boys who once had the world at their feet, now sharing a small concrete corner of it. They are forever bound by the memory of a single, horrific night on Elm Drive. A night of violence that destroyed their family, defined their lives, and continues to cast a long, dark shadow over the American imagination, forcing us to confront the terrible and often unknowable line between victim and villain.